we are going to look back at what we covered in lecture 3 and lecture 4 and see how we can make use of what we have learned so far. We will build on that to learn how to conduct some sort of policy analysis through the IS and LM model, and we'll explain in detail what that means. I would like to start with a recap of what we did in the last lecture. In the last lecture, we talked about equilibrium in the financial markets. We started by talking about what is money and how money compares to bonds, or as an asset, how it is compared to bonds. We explained that money is a liquid asset which can be used for transactions. Bonds are not liquid, but they pay interest rate. And we also explained that when we talk about money, there are different definitions of money. The narrow definition, which consider cash, coins, or current account deposits. So when you go beyond that, then we moved from the narrow definition of money to the broad definition of money. But what we were interested in is to look at how equilibrium happen in the money market. But before we do so, we explained that usually in macroeconomics, we divide the financial market into two sub-markets: money market, the money market, and bonds market. And in the last lecture, we focused on equilibrium in the money market, and we said the equilibrium in the money market will imply equilibrium in the bonds market as well. So to study the equilibrium in the money market, I told you just think of money as a good which has demand and supply. And equilibrium in the money market will be the result of the interaction between demand and supply. So demand for money and money supply. So we started with demand for money, and we said there are 3 reasons why people demand money: transaction demand, precautionary demand, and speculative demand. And we said the first one, the transaction demand, that depends on income, and the other 2 depend on interest rate. So that means the demand for money is determined by 2 factors here: the nominal income, which is the $Y. So it's positively related to nominal income, and it's negatively related to the interest rate. So it's 2 factors here. So we plot the demand for money curve, and it's a downward sloping demand curve, and it gives us the demand for money and the relationship between the demand for money and interest rate at or for a given nominal income. So that means if the nominal income increased, that means people will demand more money for transaction, and that will shift the demand for money curve to the right. I'm just recapping what I try to highlight what we covered last lecture. And then moving to the other side, the money supply side. Again, just to remind you, so equilibrium here means the interaction between both sides, money supply and the demand for money. So the demand for money is determined, we saw the relationship between demand for money and the interest rate at every or for a given level of nominal income. and that gives us a downward slope demand curve. Moving to the supply side, we said money supply is determined by monetary authorities, mainly the central bank, and that's why we treated money supply as exogenous, and that's why we draw the money supply curve as a vertical line. So it's not determined within this model, it's an exogenous variable to this model. So obviously the equilibrium, as I said, the interaction between both, so where money supply, which it's a given or a constant value here, which is M, is given by the central bank, equal the demand for money. So the second part of the right-hand side of this equation is basically the demand for money. So when both meet each other, the intersection point between the demand for money and the money supply, that will give us the equilibrium interest rate and the equilibrium money stock. So an increase in nominal income would obviously increase the demand for money, and that will shift the demand for money curve to the right, and that means the interest rate will increase. Looking at how money supply or how this equilibrium change when the central bank change money supply, if the central bank change money supply or if the central bank increased money supply, so that means that vertical line will turn or will shift to the right, and that means the interest rate will fall, and the other way if the central bank decided to apply a contractionary policy or monetary tightening, meaning reducing money supply, that will shift the money supply, which is the vertical line, to the left. So again, this is all what we covered in the previous lecture. So we also highlighted that how the central bank does this, how the central bank change money supply in the economy. They enter the bonds market as buyer or as a seller, depending on what they want to achieve. So if they want to increase money supply, then they buy bonds from the bonds market. If they want to reduce the money supply or decrease the money supply in the economy, so basically they sell, so they enter the bonds market as seller, and then this process is called open market operations. Okay? And also we highlighted the fact that most central banks today, they choose the interest rate. So the policy variable here, they choose the interest rate, and then they adjust money supply to achieve the chosen interest rate. So this is exactly what we covered last lecture. So what I want to do now is I'll carry on with the recap because it's really important to understand where we're coming from. We covered the equilibrium in the goods market in lecture 3. We covered the equilibrium in the money market or in the financial market in lecture 4. I know we focus only on the money market, but we said before, if the financial market is two sides or two sub markets, the money market and the bonds market, we explain the equilibrium in one market will imply the equilibrium in the other. But anyway, so what I want you to recall from the previous lectures, how equilibrium happen in the goods market and how equilibrium happen in the money market, and when we bring these two together, how these two markets interact with each other. So you should remember that we're still talking about the short run. Okay? So when we discuss the equilibrium in the goods market, we talk about the equilibrium in the short run, which means that the equilibrium output is mainly determined by aggregate demand. Okay? So it's very, very important to keep this in mind today. This is exactly what we did last week and the week before. So we've been mainly talking about the short run. So in the short run, which means that the output is determined mainly by the level of aggregate demand. And that's why in lecture 3 we started talking about the consumption function and talking about saving function. We talked about we treated investment and government spending as exogenous variables, as given. Today we'll change this. So government spending will continue to be exogenous today, but what we're going to change is investment. We're going to see what factors determine investment and how this affects equilibrium in the goods market. But so far what we did, yes, we studied the aggregate demand side because we understand that in the short run, output is determined by the level of aggregate demand. So we wanted to understand what determines the aggregate demand. Okay, so consumption is a very important component. We briefly talked about investment, but we took it as exogenous, so we didn't really study how that would affect equilibrium in the goods market, which we're going to do today. Government spending, we took that as an exogenous variable, which again, it is important to see how that affects the equilibrium in the goods market. We understand, or we know now, that the impact of or how fiscal policy work through changing government spending or taxes, and that would have some effect on the equilibrium in the goods market through changing the position of the aggregate demand curve. When we talked about financial markets, which we covered last week, so equilibrium happens when the demand for money equal money supply, and that determines the interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate. And we understand that if there is a shift in monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy, that again will affect the equilibrium interest rate. So these are points that we already covered from the past, from last 2 weeks. Equilibrium in the goods market and equilibrium in financial markets. So the idea here today is how these two markets may interact with each other, and that is the takeaway message from today. That's what we want to learn today. How these both markets, the goods market and the financial market, interact with each other. So is there any way that we can pool these together in one model where we can see if there is any change in policy, if there is any change in fiscal policy or monetary policy, how this will affect output? And the answer is yes, that's exactly what we're planning to do today. And this is the IS and LM model. Okay? So the ISL and LM model brings together the goods market and the financial market together to trying to understand the overall equilibrium, or the equilibrium in both markets at the same time. So what I wanted to do today, in this lecture and the next lecture, I want to derive first the IS and the LM curves, to show you where they come from. And also I want to show you how we can use this model to conduct some sort of policy analysis, meaning we just make some scenarios and then see how this change equilibrium. Okay? How output will respond to these changes. So the IS and LM model give us a very simple and very convenient way of understanding equilibrium in the economy, or in these two, giving the interaction between these two markets. So I thought maybe it's a good idea to just give you the big picture first, what's going to happen, and then we'll go later to talk about each one of these points. So basically, what is the ISLM model? So basically, we're going to have a diagram. So we're going to draw a nice diagram on the I and Y space, meaning we have Y in the horizontal axis, I in the vertical axis. I here is the interest rate. And the IS basically means this is equilibrium in the goods market, which denotes the investment equal saving. And this is something we already covered when we talked about the goods market. We said there's an alternative way of thinking how equilibrium happened. Remember, the equilibrium condition in the goods market when demand equal production. We assume no inventory. There's no inventories. That means firms hold no inventories, means that for equilibrium to happen, production need to be equal to demand. So we also drive equilibrium in the goods market using this condition when investment equals saving. And I show you this in the lecture, I think it was lecture 3. So the idea here that IS basically tell us that this, every point on that curve, which we call IS, again, it's coming from investment equal saving. This is where it comes from, the IS. So every point on that curve, on the IS curve, show us equilibrium in the goods market. Okay, just remember what we measure in both axes. We have Y in the horizontal axis and I, or the interest rate, on the vertical axis. On the other side, LM comes from liquidity preference, which means demand for money, equal money supply. So M here stands for money supply. And L is liquidity preference or demand for money. Okay, so again, every point on the LM curve means this is an equilibrium point in financial markets. Okay, so obviously now the interaction between both, meaning the point where these both the intersection point between both, that will give us the simultaneous equilibrium in both markets together. So again, we studied first the goods market and equilibrium in the goods market, and then we studied the equilibrium in financial markets. And today we're trying to bring these together and see how we can understand the equilibrium in both markets at the same time, which is given by, or is provided by, the ISLM analysis. So this is the very big picture before we jump into the details. So what we're going to see now is IS, LM. These are two curves. Okay, the IS denote or show the equilibrium in the goods market. LM show the equilibrium in the financial market. IS is a downward slope demand curve. Downward slope curve. So, and the LM traditionally used to or looks like an upward slope curve, but today we'll talk more about this idea about if central banks choose first interest rate and then adjust money supply, how this is going to affect the shape or the slope of the or the way the LM looks like, LM curve looks like. But before we start with the first one, which is the IS, you should know that this is a demand side analysis, demand side based analysis. And again, why? Because we assumed we are in the short run. We're still talking about the short run. So I'm saying it again and again and again. We're talking about the short run, and what we're going to do today, again, we talk about the short run. So changes in the demand side can happen through changes in fiscal policy or monetary policy. When changing fiscal policy means that changes to the government spending or the taxes, changes to or shifts in the monetary policy means changing money supply or the interest rate. So it should be clear before we start that the ISLM model is used for short-run demand-side policy analysis. Okay? So that's the big picture. So what we're going to see is just a graph or a diagram where we can have these relationships in one place, put these together, and see the overall equilibrium. So we'll start with the first one. With the first curve, the goods market, the IS curve. So again, IS here means investment savings, or investments equal savings, and that give us this is the equilibrium condition in the goods market. So just to recall from lecture 3, we assume that investment is exogenous, is given or a constant, and this is not true. So we did this just to simplify the analysis in lecture 3 when we talked about the goods market. But in fact, investment depends on production, Y, or sales, and the interest rate. So just think about it. If firms face higher demand, so obviously what they need to do, so to respond to that, they need to change their investment, so they need to expand their investment. Maybe they need to build a new plant or buy a new machine, or maybe start like a new production line. So they need to invest more. They need to spend more in investment. Okay? So remember, we just assumed no inventories. So we still carry on with the same assumptions. With the same assumption, no inventories. So for firms to respond, then maybe they need to spend more in investment, or if the other way, if the demand is falling, so that means maybe they need to cut investment. So at the end of the day, here we're talking about production or sales as one of the important factors that determine investment. To expand their investments, maybe they need to borrow money. So in such case, then they will pay interest. So that means the interest rate is another determinant of investment. Okay? Or even if they're not going to borrow money, usually when you want to undertake an investment, you try to think about the opportunity cost, or try to think about the return to this investment, and in such a case you'll be thinking of the interest rate as a kind of opportunity cost of what investments you're going to do. And if the return to this investment is not at least equal to the interest rate, if not higher, then you probably wouldn't take that investment. So my point here is, these are these two factors here, production, and which equals income. Remember, it's the same as income. And also interest rate. These two determine the investment. Okay? So in lecture 3, the first time we talked about this model, the goods market, we just ignored that. We just assumed that investment is exogenous, it's giving, so we didn't really bother about what determines investment. But today, it's really important. So if you want to understand the IS curve, or equilibrium in the goods market, you really need to understand what determines investment. Obviously, assuming that we really understand what determines consumption as well. Okay, so today we will have, so the aggregate demand is determined by the first term here. This is the consumption function. So consumption is determined by disposable income, Y minus T, and plus investment. And investment here is determined by, again, Y and I, plus G. We'll carry on taking G as given or exogenous variable, and this will be our fiscal policy variable in the examples we'll give. So what you see now is the IS relation, which exactly is just the equilibrium in the goods market. So we just trying to represent this on a graph. So it's exactly what we did in lecture 3. The only difference here, so it looks exactly the same. The only difference here is that we keep in mind that we're not taking investment as exogenous. So investment now is determined by Y and also determined by I. So what we have here, this ZZ or the red line is the aggregate demand. What we measure in the horizontal axis is the output level, and on the vertical axis we have the aggregate demand, which we call Z, or aggregate demand AD, whatever you call it. So the equilibrium condition is the same. Demand equal output. Remember, we carry on with our assumption about inventories. Okay, no inventories so far. So to have equilibrium in the goods market, the equilibrium condition is, again, demand equal output. So where this happened exactly here at point A, where this curve, the aggregate demand curve, intersect with the 45 degrees line, and I explained before what is the significance or the meaning of the 45-degree line, but I will say it again. So when you have a 45-degree line, so that gives you the points that where whatever you measure here is equal to whatever you measure here. So in our analysis here, in this analysis, it means that every point on that 45 degrees line, output, okay, is equal whatever you measure here. So this point here, in this case, output equal demand, and that's exactly what we want, because before that point, you'll see that demand is above output. After that point, you'll see that demand is below output. So the only point where both are equal is the intersection point, where this point A, because this point A exists in both on the 45-degree line and also on the aggregate demand curve. This is upward sloping curve because for a given level of interest rate, if there's an increase in output, that means an increase in demand for goods, and this happened because of the effect on consumption and investment. So if I go back here, you will see here consumption is determined by Y and investment is determined by Y. Okay? So if that changes, that means both investment and consumption will change. And that's why this curve here, the aggregate demand, is upward sloping curve. The other thing that you should notice here that this time we draw this as a curve, but again, it wouldn't really be different if you draw it as a straight line. So it's not going to make any difference. One more thing to notice here, which is the aggregate demand curve, which is ZZ curve. This one, the red one, is kind of flatter than the 45-degree line because we're assuming here that if there's a change or increase in output, that means there's a less than 1-for-1 increase in demand. And we explained this in the previous lecture when we treated investment as exogenous. We said if people receive more income, they spend part of that income on consumption, which of course that translates into change in the aggregate demand. Why? Do you remember the marginal propensity to consume when we said that if the marginal propensity to consume is 80% and income increased by 100 million, so that means they will spend on consumption only 80 million, not the 100, not 1-for-1. So the increase will be less than 1-for-1. Okay? So we'll carry on with the same situation where we have a less than 1-for-1 increase in demand. And obviously now we understand that point A is the equilibrium point. Okay? So there is nothing new except how we treat investment here. in lecture 3, we treated investment as exogenous. Now, investment is determined by Y and I. Okay? So, and we also assume that no inventories. So this is something we assumed in lecture 3, and we carry on, we take it over to this lecture. So we assume that no inventories, and that makes the equilibrium condition when demand equal output. So how are we going to plot the IS curve? Before I do that, let's just now think of a scenario here. And I want you to tell me what would happen. Okay? Let's say now the interest rate has increased. How this will affect aggregate demand? Would aggregate demand, basically aggregate demand curve will shift. Is it going to be shifting up or down? And why? So again, let's just think about it. Hani is asking about aggregate demand and say interest rate change. So how interest rate affect aggregate demand? Then think of the components of the aggregate demand. What are the components of aggregate demand? Consumption, investment, government spending. We're treating government spending as exogenous. Okay? So where interest rate appears in this equation, it affects investment. Okay? So that means the interest rate will affect the aggregate demand through its effect on investment. So a higher interest rate, what does that mean to investment? Would investors invest more or less? They will invest less. Okay, so that means investment will fall. So if investment drop, that means the aggregate demand curve, which is here, this one will shift downward. Okay, so I'll say that again because this is very important to how we drive the IS. If you don't understand this, what I said now, then the IS curve is not going to make any sense to you. Okay, so I'll say it again. So in this model here, how interest rate affect this equilibrium through its effect on investment, which is one of the components of the aggregate demand, which is the red line here. So if if the interest rate increased, that means there's a negative relationship between interest rate and investment. So if interest rate increased, that means investment will be less. That means this red curve here will go down, will shift downward. Okay? So let me talk about the other case. If the interest rate falls, okay, how this is going to affect aggregate demand? Again, think about how this affects investment, and then we'll tell you that will make it easy to find out how this will affect aggregate demand. So if interest rate falls, okay, that means maybe it's now it gives incentives to investors to invest more, to borrow and invest more. Also, it makes the opportunity cost for investment lower, so again, which increase investment. So increasing investment means this is a higher level of aggregate demand, so that will shift aggregate demand upward. And that is the whole idea here. So I'll try to do this, hopefully with this pen here, so hopefully it will work. So let's do this. So if we have, let's assume a situation where we have an initial equilibrium in the goods market. So we have Y here, and let's say this is going to be the aggregate demand, and then we have the 45 degrees line, and then let's say the first situation here where we have this level of aggregate demand. So let's call this Z1 or aggregate demand 1. Okay, so where's the equilibrium here? This is the equilibrium point. So basically this at y1, and that tells us the equilibrium in the goods market. So what I want to do you remember what I said about the IS and LM model? Which it's on the IY space. So what I need basically is another graph, let's say here. I'll put it here below this one, so I can see what happened to it's not very easy to use this, but I'll try. I'm trying my best. Okay. So remember what we said. The IS is kind of a diagram on the I. So I here is the interest rate, Y space. So what I on the vertical axis, Y on the horizontal axis. So what we want to do here now is, let's say this is the Y1 level, which is, you just can carry this from here. So this is basically Y1. So for some given interest rate, so let's say this was the I1 level. So this point doesn't look great, but so now let's assume a situation where I, which is the interest rate, has dropped. So now let's say we have I2, which is greater than I1. Okay? Sorry, dropped means the other way. So I2 is smaller than I1. So how this is going to affect the aggregate demand? Does anyone remember? So what would happen to the aggregate demand? Can anyone tell me? So is this going, basically this going to shift the aggregate demand curve? Is it going to shift up or down? How investment affect the aggregate demand? Do you remember? Through its effect on investment. So, sorry, how the interest rate affect aggregate demand? Through its effect on investment. So now a lower level of interest rate means a higher level of investment, means the aggregate demand curve will shift upward. Okay? So let me just now, so this is the, this is I1. Okay, so this is the interest rate. The first interest rate was I1. Now we have a new interest rate, which is lower than I1, which means that this curve here will shift upward. So we'll go somewhere here. So this is aggregate demand 2. So this is the new equilibrium point. So which give us Y2. And then just to know here, Y2 is here. Okay? So remember, I2 is below I1. So I2 is somewhere here. So let's say this is I2. So if you just find this point here, which combine these two, I1, Y1 is this point. So this point is I2, Y2. If you connect these two together, this will give us the IS curve. Okay? So again, that green line is the IS curve. I know it doesn't look very beautiful, but it just gives you the idea. Okay? So how we drive the IS curve? So basically, you change the interest rate, and then you see what happened to aggregate demand, how that shift the aggregate demand curve, and then you try to get this combination of interest rate and output level. Okay? So that's exactly what I did. So I started with the first level of aggregate demand, and this was the equilibrium point here. So this is the first equilibrium point, okay, at any given interest rate. It could be any given level of interest rate, which I1 here. So this is the first combination. I just need 2 points to plot the graph, okay. The second one, which I assume that there was like interest rate had fallen from I1 to I2, and how this is going to affect aggregate demand. Basically, aggregate demand will shift upward again, because as I said, if the interest rate falls, that means investment will increase, and that is a component here, or contribute to the aggregate demand, which means that aggregate demand curve will shift upward, giving us a new equilibrium point. If you identify these 2 points on the IY space, connect these 2 points, that will give you the IS curve. So the IS curve here denotes equilibrium in the goods market. You see the 2 points I plotted here, these are 2 equilibrium points on the goods market. And that means every point on that IS curve denotes an equilibrium state or point in the goods market. So that's basically what I did, but the other way around. So this is the case. What you see now is if interest rate has increased. So what I showed you here, the case, how we drive, of course you can do it this way or this way. So I show you how to drive the IS curve when the interest rate had fallen, but this one when the interest rate had increased, which is exactly the same, give you the same curve. So in this example, or the way we drive it here, so basically what you have, this is the first equilibrium point, which is A, and whatever I is here is this one, which is the lower level of IF interest rate, and this is the combination here. So A here is the combination, IY combination that is associated to this equilibrium in the goods market. So what happened here is that the interest rate had increased from I to whatever I prime is, so it's some level which is higher than I, okay? How the aggregate demand curve will respond to that? The aggregate demand curve will shift downward, and that will give us a new equilibrium point here, which again, once you identify this point on the IY space, which is A prime here, connecting these 2 points give us the IS curve, which looks more beautiful than the one I drew, but to give you the idea. So at least if you don't like this, so it's more neat and nicer here, but it's smaller. Okay, so is that clear? So which one you like? Both are the same, by the way. The same are, the only difference, this is just a curve, and this is, I plot it as a straight line, and it wouldn't make any difference, okay? So it's exactly the same. Okay, so just one more thing before we go, okay? Feel like you're getting excited and you're getting ready to go. So we still have 5 minutes, okay? So we haven't finished. Okay, see people start putting their coats on and getting ready to leave. So please, we still have 5 minutes, okay? So please give me my 5 minutes. So what I did so far now, just drive the IS curve. So do you understand now what the IS curve is? Okay, so every point on that IS curve, which is downward sloping curve, that give you equilibrium in the goods market, okay? So 2 things that you should know about the IS curve. So you need to think about the slope. Well, it's downward sloping, but it could have been steeper or flatter. So what determined that? This is something we should think about, okay? And also, what would change the position of the IS curve? Basically, what would move it right or left? So we need to understand this, okay? So basically, in terms of the slope, we understand, okay, it's downward sloping curve, and the slope or the steepness depends on how sensitive investment is to changes to the interest rate. Okay, so if it is very sensitive, so that means small changes in the interest rate bring massive changes to investment. So that means the IS will become more flat, will be flatter. Okay. Of course, the other way, if it is not really sensitive, if investment is not really sensitive, doesn't respond to changes in the interest rate, that means that IS will become more like steeper or more like a vertical line. Okay, so this is kind of, but in all cases we know it's downward sloping curve. So how steep it is, okay, that depends on how sensitive investment to, or how much investment will respond to the change in the interest rate. That will determine the steepness or the slope of that, how steep that the IS curve is. So what would shift the IS? So just as a general rule, anything that would shift aggregate demand will shift the IS. So anything that will increase aggregate demand will shift the IS to the right. Anything that will decrease or will lower aggregate demand, that will shift the IS curve to the left. Okay? So these are very important. Why? Because basically this is what we're going to do when we do policy analysis. As a very quick example here, this is an example of an increase in taxes. So let's say there is a contractionary fiscal policy, for whatever reason the government decided to increase taxes. How this is going to affect IS curve? Remember, here we have taxes and the aggregate demand. Where did we go? Yeah, I think here. So where taxes? So they here they affect the aggregate demand. Okay. So the idea here now, if fiscal policy results in, or a change in fiscal policy results in increasing taxes, that means the IS curve will shift to the left. Why? Because higher taxes will shift the aggregate demand downward. Okay. So anything that shifts the aggregate demand downward, that will shift the IS to the left. Okay? Is that clear? Any questions? Okay, I'll see you next lecture. Thank you. In the first part of the lecture today, we understand now that IS-LM model, we will have two curves. One which is the IS, which represent equilibrium in the goods market. And the LM, so IS comes from investment equal saving, which another way of understanding the equilibrium condition in the goods market. We saw how we can drive the IS curve, and we know it's a downward sloping curve. We know what determines the steepness or the slope of that curve, how steep it is. We also learn about how or what shifts the IS, which is very important because that's what we going to see when we talk about policy analysis. So what we finished the lecture, or the first part of the lecture with, was a general rule that you keep in mind. So anything raises the aggregate demand will shift the IS curve to the right. Anything that would lower aggregate demand, that means it will shift the IS curve to the left. We looked at one example when taxes increase. So how taxes would affect the aggregate demand curve here. So we're talking about this curve here, the aggregate demand, ZZ. So remember the components of the aggregate demand. We talk about consumption, investment, and government spending. So fiscal policy effect. We took government spending as exogenous. So if government spending change, that means this will shift the aggregate demand curve, and that will cause a shift to the IS curve. The same thing applies to taxes. So higher taxes means lower aggregate demand, and that means the IS curve will shift to the left. So as we said, so this is how it looks like. And what that means, so this curve moved from this one, this is the first IS curve, and then when taxes increased, then to T prime, which is higher level of taxes than T, then the IS curve shift to the left. So before that happened, we understand why, because the aggregate demand should move downward, the aggregate demand curve. So on this graph, now an increase in taxes will shift IS to the left, and that means at the same level of interest rate, we have a lower level of output, which we move from Y to Y prime here, so this is the same level of interest rate, which is I. So this is one side now of the story, the IS story, the ISLM model. So just the takeaway message quickly, we know the IS curve represents equilibrium in the goods market, and we know how to drive it. We know what factors can shift the IS curve, whether to the right or to the left, depending on how they affect the aggregate demand. So anything raises aggregate demand, that will shift the IS to the right. Anything lowers aggregate demand, that will shift IS to the left. So now we move to the other side of the story. Remember, financial markets. So the first side, the IS, represent equilibrium in the goods market, and LM represent the equilibrium in financial markets. So let's just recall what we learned about equilibrium in the money market. So as we said earlier, and also last lecture, it's the interaction between demand for money and money supply. So we took money supply as exogenous or as giving. So that's why you see the money supply curve here as a vertical line, as you can see on this graph. So this is money supply, nothing new. This is what we said last time. And a downward sloping curve for the demand for money. And we know that there are two factors, income, nominal income, and interest rate. These affect demand for money. Remember when we said the demand for money, there are three reasons why we demand money. So transaction demand, which depends on the level of nominal income. So higher income level should be associated with higher demand for transaction, demand for money because of transaction. And we also said there is precautionary demand and speculative demand, and both are related to or determined by the interest rate, and this is a negative relationship. So if for a higher interest rate, that means lower demand for money for these reasons, speculative and precautionary demand. So the equilibrium here obviously is the interaction between both, and I ask you to think about money as any good where you have the equilibrium determined by the interaction between demand and supply. And what we have, this is exactly what we have here. We took money supply as exogenous, determined by a central bank. That's why you have a vertical line. We know what determines the demand for money, then the intersection point, which is A here, where money supply equals money demand. And that determines the interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate, and the money stock as well. Okay? So this is the equilibrium in the money market as we showed it last lecture. We also explained how changes in nominal income can affect this situation, equilibrium in the money market. So, for example, if the nominal income has increased, that means the demand for money curve will shift to the right. That's what you see here. And again, this is from last lecture. Okay? So I haven't said anything new, the last two slides. So these are just recalling what we said already in lecture 4. So what we have here, we have a change in income, which caused a shift in the demand. So nominal income has increased from Y to Y prime. So the demand for money curve has shifted to the right. So we still have the same level of M, which again determined by monetary authorities or the central bank, but now the interest rate has increased from I to I prime. So keep that in mind, because that's what we need to derive the LM curve. Okay? How changes in income would affect equilibrium in the money market. So when income increases, that shifts the demand for money to the right, and obviously that means if income decreases, that will shift the money demand curve to the left. Okay, so we're just going to make a very simple modification to this, which basically, rather than looking at, so this is the first line here, again from last lecture, the equilibrium condition in the money market take place here, or the equilibrium happen when money, which is a fixed amount here, it's exogenous, this is money supply, is just given M at M level, equal, so the left-hand side here is the money supply, and the right-hand side is demand for money. So what are the determinants of demand for money? We said nominal income, which is the $Y here, just to stress that this is nominal income, and the interest rate, which is I here. So what we're going to do, just to make it more convenient to drive the LM curve, because do you remember the LM curve, the IS and the LM as well, it's on the I and Y, so the interest rate and output space. So you have output, or Y, on the horizontal axis, and you have I on the vertical axis. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to divide both sides by the price level, which will give me M over P. This is going to be, this is the real money supply, equals, now rather than having the nominal income here, I'm actually having only Y, because the nominal income divided by the real, divided the price, that give you the real income. So what we have here, we have real money demand, or real demand for money on the right-hand side. Okay? So that will make it easy, or more convenient now when we drive the LM curve. So just, this is the slight modification we've done now. We've just divided both sides by the price level. And we basically expressing this relationship in terms of, or in real terms, in terms of goods, not nominal or dollars. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going just to plot this equilibrium. And I'll show you what that means to the LM relationship. So let's say now we start with a first situation where we have, let's say, an initial equilibrium in the money market. Let's say, so we have here money, and we have on the vertical axis, we have the interest rate. So the equilibrium in this market, again, it's the result of the interaction between money supply, which we treat it as constant. So let's say this is the level of money stock at this point. This is what it is given to us by the central bank. And there's a kind of, okay, this is the demand for money curve. So say this is MD, let's call it 1, and here is the interest rate level. So this is at I. So what I want to do now, I want to have the same, but on the I and Y space, so meaning I want I on the vertical axis and Y on the horizontal axis. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to move this to the, start like another graph here, where what I have here in this axis here is the Y and the interest rate. So let's say this is the associated level. So this is, at this point, this is I. And at this point, we had, this is the income level, let's say, call it Y1, and I'm going to call this I1. So this is the point that is associated on the I and Y space. So this is a given level of real income, and this is how the equilibrium happen in the money market. So now let's assume a scenario where the income, or Y, has increased. Remember, what determines the demand for money? We say the transaction and precautionary and speculative demand, which depend on interest rate. So if income has changed, remember from the previous slide, this one, for a higher level of income, that means demand for money will shift to the right. So let's follow the same scenario. So if we apply this here, so that means, let's say, if I'm going to do this, let's say in red. So that means now if we have Y has increased from Y1 to Y2, and Y2 is greater than Y1. So now a higher level of income. So we'll see what's happened here. We said this will shift the demand for money. Let's say this is going to be the second one, so MD2, and the associated. So we know now that Y2 is higher, so Y2 is going to be somewhere here, and the equilibrium interest rate is going to be here, so let's call it I2. So that means this is going to be at a higher point here. So this is the equivalent point on this space, on I and Y. If you connect these 2 points, this will give us the LM curve, which is, again, every point on this curve show you equilibrium on in the money market. So again, let me just briefly explain what I did. So I started with initial point where there's equilibrium in the money market, and that give me, at a given level of income, real income, there is an interest rate, so equilibrium give me the interest rate and the M, or the level of money stock at that point, which is the green line. So that's the equilibrium, the first equilibrium point, which was associated to this I1 level of interest rate. And this is the point on this space I and Y. So this is the given level of real income at this point. So then I assumed a scenario in which Y has increased, so real income has increased. And of course, you would imagine that when income increases, that means there's more demand for money for transaction. And that means the demand for money, the curve for the money demand will shift to the right. So that's exactly what happened here, this shift from MD1 to MD2. Remember, this is associated with a higher real income, which means Y2 is more or greater than Y1. So that's why I put it on the right side of Y1. And what has resulted here is, what has happened here is that the interest rate has gone up to I2, which I just tried to identify here. So this is the same level, I2. And then if you connect, so now I got 2 points. If I connect these points together, that should give me the LM curve. So you could see now, you can see the LM curve is upward sloping curve, okay? But when I introduced this in the beginning of the lecture, I just say that was the traditional way of thinking about LM. So just keep it in mind now. So we have upward sloping curve till now, and I'll tell you why we might look at this in a different way now. But what we have here, so the same way when I talked about the IS model, you need to think about why this curve would shift to the right, or why would it shift to the left. So with the IS curve, we talked about fiscal policy components or policy variables like G or T, the government spending or taxes, and we show that how this changes in fiscal policy would affect aggregate demand, and as a result will affect the IS. So if there's an increase in government spending, that will shift the aggregate demand upward, and then that means the IS curve will shift to the right. In the same way, in the similar way, we need to think about the LM curve, okay? So here we talk about the money market. So basically, we're looking at what would shift demand for money to the right or to the left, and the same thing about when we talk about monetary policy, because the policy variable here is actually either the monetary policy or the interest rate, depending on how or which variable the central bank targets. So the traditional way of thinking about monetary policy is that the central bank choose or change the money supply, so either by increasing money supply or decreasing money supply, which as a result affect the interest rate. So in such case, then, if there is a monetary expansion, for example, so the central bank want to extend or increase money supply, we explain how central banks do that through open market operations. So if you want to expand or increase money supply, then they go to they enter the bonds market as buyers. So basically, they buy bonds and they pay money. So that means they increase, actually, they pay with money. So that increasing the money supply. And that will shift the LM curve to the right. Okay? So thinking again about a contractionary monetary policy, which is the opposite effect, then that will shift the LM curve to the left. So we need to understand what shifts the IS and what shifts the LM. And just to make it easy, it's very straightforward, because we know that changes in fiscal policy, which happen through G and T, or government spending and taxes, this mainly will affect the goods market because G is part of the aggregate demand. Changes in money supply, okay, that basically will happen through the money market. So the effect should go through the LM curve. Okay, that's equilibrium in the money market. Okay, so don't confuse yourself. It's just very, very clear and very simple. Okay, so changes in fiscal policy take effect through its effect on the goods market, because goods market, remember, we talk about the short run. We're still talking about the short run. And that's why when we said, I said in the beginning, keep in mind this is a short run or demand side analysis, because basically the changes the output, the equilibrium output in the short run is determined by changes in the aggregate demand. So the effect of changes in fiscal policy probably will go through the aggregate demand and will affect the IS. Changes in monetary policy will go through the money market and then will affect LM, okay, the LM curve. So now, hopefully it is now clear how these how the IS curve and the LM curve, where they come from. And again, as I said before, LM comes from liquidity preference, so L stands for liquidity, equal, so that's the demand for money, equal money supply, this is where M comes from. The same way as IS and I for investment is for saving, LM is for liquidity and money supply. So this is the equilibrium condition in each market. So the slope of the LM, so the LM could be steeper as well or could be flatter, the same way we thought about the IS. So if you remember, we said how steep or flat the IS curve is, that depends on how much investment is sensitive to changes in the interest rate. Okay? Here, when we talk about how flat or how steep the LM curve, it depends on how it depends on income elasticity or interest and the interest elasticity of money demand. So how much money demand will change after a change in income or interest rate? Is it going to increase by much if, for example, income has increased, or is going to increase by only a small change after income has increased? So that will determine, so the larger income elasticity, if it is very sensitive to changes in income, if money demand is very sensitive to changes in income, that means the LM will be steeper. The LM curve will be steeper. And of course, the vice versa. So that, now we understand IS is a downward slope curve and LM is upward sloping curve. So as I say with the LM case, I said this is kind of the traditional way of thinking of LM. However, in the last lecture we said the central bank or modern central banks usually choose the interest rate. So the policy variable is the interest rate, not money supply. Okay? So this analysis, before when we drive the LM, we just thought of the LM, okay, we have equilibrium, we have the money supply is giving, and then changes in money supply will move that vertical line to the right or to the left. But as we explained at the end of the last lecture, we said usually what central banks today do, they choose the interest rate level first, and then they adjust the money supply to achieve that interest rate. What does that mean to the LM? So the LM curve, I mean. So that means the LM curve is horizontal, as you see it on the graph now. Okay? We already know how to drive the LM. That's fine. The traditional way of thinking about the LM is fine. But this is just kind of some I would say, reality or some real, more realistic assumption about the LM and how it looks like. And this is what we're going to follow in the next part of the lecture when we analyze, when we look at policy analysis. But maybe in the next lecture, I'll actually talk about the effectiveness of both monetary policy and fiscal policy. So I will play a little bit with this how steep or flat both curves are, the IS and LM, and we'll show you the differences. But for now, let's just think of this as what we discussed in the last lecture. So central banks choose the interest rate, and which means here we have the same level of interest rate, whatever the output is, so whatever Y is. So that would change by, if the central bank choose a higher level of interest rate, that means would be above the current one, or if they choose the current LM curve, if they choose lower interest rate, that means would be below that. So this is why you see the LM curve horizontal line. Again, it's just because we know that this is more realistic because the central banks choose the interest rate level and then they adjust the money supply to achieve that level. So that's why we have the interest rate, the LM curve horizontal line. So again, we have I on the vertical axis and Y on the horizontal axis. So what we need to do now is to think about equilibrium, okay? So we combining, so in the ISLM model, we combine both markets, the goods market and the the money market or financial markets, okay? So we have the IS representing equilibrium in, so every point on that curve, on the IS curve, represent equilibrium in the goods market. And LM, every point on that curve, the LM curve, represent equilibrium in financial markets. So now bringing these two together, when we bring these both together, we have the IS relation, which something we showed it in the first part of the lecture. So Y, output, depend on consumption, and consumption depends on disposable income, and this should be plus, not equal. So, and I, which depends on Y and I, so the interest rate, plus G we continue to have or to consider or treat G, government spending, as an exogenous variable. On the other side, we treat, given that our LM curve is horizontal because, as we explained, central banks choose the interest rate, so it's kind of given by the central bank. So having these two, that's why you see I here equal I bar, because this is something, or this is some level of the interest rate that is given by the central bank. So the central bank change it for any level of Y, so, and then they can change it. So increase it or decrease it, and that's what they target, and then, or that's what they choose first, and then based on that they adjust money supply to achieve that level of interest rate. So the IS and LM relation together, these two together, determine the output level. So the equilibrium in both markets simultaneously. So you have both markets cleared when you have the interaction between both, which will give us, as you might expect, the intersection point between both curves. So as I explained before, this is need to be clear. You need to understand this well. So every point or any point on the downward sloping IS curve correspond to equilibrium in the goods market. Any point on the LM, which in our case now is horizontal, and I show you the traditional way of thinking about LM, which is upward sloping curve. But if we take into consideration the way that modern central banks work, then we would probably have it horizontal line, the LM curve. But any point on that curve still, so regardless of whether it is horizontal or upward sloping, any point in that curve basically correspond to an equilibrium or equilibrium in financial markets. So as we said, so the interaction between both, that will give us equilibrium in both markets, financial markets and goods markets. So the goods market and financial market. So basically what we do here, we just bring both together. The IS, which we know it's downward sloping curve, which represent equilibrium in the goods market, and LM, which represent equilibrium in financial markets. And this point here, the intersection point, basically this is the equilibrium in both markets simultaneously, because this point A exists on, it lies on the IS, and at the same time it lies on the LM. So this is the only point where both markets are cleared. So this is the only point where both markets are in equilibrium. And that gives us the associated output level or income level. So this is the equilibrium level of output, and also the equilibrium interest rate. Is that clear? So this is how equilibrium in both markets. So all what we did is just we brought these together in one graph, and this is basically the IS-LM model. So we learn how to drive the IS curve, we learn how to drive the LM curve, and now, which that's how we use them then, or this is the importance of understanding, this is just how you could actually have, how you can have a tool to analyze or to do some policy analysis. So now, for now, we understand, okay, the intersection point between both, that tell us the equilibrium in both markets at the same time. So what we need to do then, we need to think about, okay, so now we understand IS, equilibrium in the goods market, LM, equilibrium, the equilibrium in financial markets, and the intersection is equilibrium in both. Now, what would happen if there's a policy change? That is the idea here, okay? So it's like having a very convenient and simple analytical way or analytical tool to explain the effect of different policies. So let's now start with just reminder with what we mean by fiscal policy and monetary policy. Okay? So again, fiscal policy, basically, if the policy is to decrease G minus T, so G here is government spending, T is taxes. So if you have a fiscal contraction means, or a contractionary policy, that means G minus T should decrease. Or that's called fiscal consolidation as well. Okay, it's the same. If you increase G minus T, that means there's a fiscal expansion. So the government spend, so the government spending is more than, or increasing the government spending minus taxes. So that means more an expansionary policy. So on the other side, we understand with monetary policy again. So that you increase money supply, that means expansionary monetary policy. You decrease money supply, that's contractionary policy or monetary tightening, which we look at it now. But before Now let's see how fiscal policy changes will affect equilibrium. This is our equilibrium point, equilibrium in both markets. Now let's have a situation or a scenario where there is a change in fiscal policy. So there are steps you need to keep in mind now when we look at this, which I already mentioned before. So first, ask yourself, does the policy change affect IS or LM? So think about whether it's going to happen in the goods market or in the financial market. So then you need to think about, what does this mean to equilibrium, output, and interest rates? And then you need just to describe the effect in words. So these are the kind of steps in your mind just to think about, okay, there's a change in government spending. Where the effect or how this, which part of this ISLM model will be affected by this? Oh, we know that government spending is part of aggregate demand, and aggregate demand determine equilibrium in the goods market, and that means the effect should go through the IS curve, okay? And so on. So that's just a way of thinking how you should analyze or think about these policy changes. So what we have here is an increase in taxes, okay? So an increase in taxes, that effect should go through the effect of taxes on aggregate demand. So that means the effect should go through the effect on, or should go through the change or shift in the IS curve, because this IS curve represents equilibrium in the goods market. So now the question I want to know, okay, which way is it going to shift, right or left, the IS curve now? Then it depends on how the effect of that policy change on aggregate demand. Okay, so just see the sequence. So I thought first, okay, there's a change in taxes. Where that should go, where that effect should go, it should go through the aggregate demand, because taxes is part of or affect aggregate demand. So now I need to know which direction the shift should be. Okay, so higher taxes mean it's lower aggregate demand, and we said before the general rule is anything that lowers aggregate demand should shift the IS to the left. Okay, and that's what we have here. So we have, this is the first IS curve with the first equilibrium point A, and this is associated with this level of I, interest rate, and this level of output. Now what happened is increase in taxes lowered the aggregate demand curve, and that will shift the IS curve to the left, and the result here is we still have the same interest rate, but we have a lower level of output, which is Y prime. So this is the effect of the policy change, okay? So you need to think about it this way. Which side will be affected by this policy change? Okay, you should understand what determines or the equilibrium in both markets. So if there's something to do with aggregate demand, so that means the effect will go through the goods market, which means it will shift the IS curve. If the change or the policy change affect the money side or the financial markets or money markets, then that means the effect should go through the LM curve, because that's what represents financial markets. So this is a very simple example. So if there was an increase in government spending, how this is going to affect the equilibrium? Can anyone tell me? So this is just another case now. We have an increase in government spending. So first you need to ask yourself where this effect should go. Should go through the goods market or financial markets? Okay, so basically it should go through, I can't hear anyone. So if we have an increase in government spending, is this something to do with or to affect the goods market or financial markets? Goods market, yes, so the IS curve, okay? So now, I want to know how this is going to affect the aggregate demand. Is it going to raise the aggregate demand or lower the aggregate demand, having a higher level of government spending? So that should raise the aggregate demand, okay? So anything raises the aggregate demand should shift the IS curve to the right, okay? That's right, okay? So that's very clear now. So how fiscal policy affect equilibrium. In a similar fashion, we could think of monetary policy. Monetary policy decrease the interest rate. So if the central bank choose to lower the interest rate, if they want to lower interest rate, then they need to increase money supply, okay? So to increase money supply, what do they need to do? How do they do that? How do they increase money supply? How do central banks increase money supply? Remember, open market operations, okay? So they go to the bonds market. Do they buy or sell bonds to increase money supply? They go as buyer. So they buy bonds, and that will increase money supply, okay? And that is called monetary expansion, because they increase money supply. If we have a monetary contraction, that means if the central bank choose to increase the interest rate, so that means they need to decrease money supply. And to decrease money supply, they need to go to the bonds market, they need to sell bonds. And in that case, it's called monetary contraction or monetary tightening. Okay? So how is this going to affect our equilibrium? Remember? So what should we think about first? Which side will be affected by this change? Is it going to be the goods market or the money market? And then that will tell you which curve will be affected mainly by this change, okay? Is it IS or LM? In this case, let's say there's a decrease in interest rate. A decrease in interest rate means this is a monetary expansion, meaning that to decrease the interest rate, that means the central bank should increase money supply, and to increase money supply, they buy bonds, okay? So they enter the bonds market as a buyer, and again, this is part of the open market operations. But how this is going to affect our equilibrium is very straightforward now. I guess you should find it now is very, very straightforward. So now lowering the interest rate, so given that we have this horizontal LM curve, so lowering interest rate basically just mean you move this or shift this LM curve downward. So we basically, the first equilibrium point with A at the higher level of interest rate, I bar, and again bar here means that's what explains the horizontal shape of that LM curve, because it's given by the central bank. So changing that by the central bank to a lower interest rate, which is I bar prime here, this means shift the ILM downward, and that means we move from equilibrium point here A to A prime, which means how this is going to affect interest rate and output. Obviously, interest rate is by that's the policy change has dropped, but also this has some impact on output, which here means we move from Y to Y prime, which means that output has increased as a result of monetary expansion. Okay, so this is an expansionary policy, monetary policy, which results in increasing the output, the equilibrium output from Y to Y prime. I probably stop at this point before I talk about, next time we'll talk about policy mix and effectiveness of different policy, monetary policy and fiscal policy. But just very quickly, just the main message is how equilibrium is determined in both markets, the goods market and financial markets simultaneously. The IS and LAM model is very convenient and very simple way to think about it, and most importantly, to understand the effect of policy changes or policy shifts using this model. Any questions? Okay, thank you. See you next time.